What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another Getting Started in Warhammer 40k video. Today, we're going to be talking about Tyranids, and in this video, I'm going to break down getting into the Tyranid faction, starting from the combat patrol level all the way up through a strike force level. We're going to talk about an overview of the army, its mechanics, some basic tactics to use with it, as well as some sample lists that you can use to grow that force from a small combat patrol up to a full-size game. As with all my getting started videos, this video is intended to give advice to players just getting started in the game, but it's just intended to be some advice. If you want to try specific units or list builds other than what I recommend here, feel free to do so. Obviously, one of the joys of Warhammer 40k is experimentation, and if you want to try different unit compositions and list builds, you should feel absolutely free. Now, Tyranids are a very unique army in 40k. They are an alien horror from beyond the edge of the galaxy, hell-bent on consuming biomass from other civilizations and incorporating it into their own swarm. They scour entire planets lifeless, and they don't really care for the politics and morals of humanity or the galaxy's other civilizations, only that they continue to consume and continue to swell their ranks. On the tabletop, Tyranids play very differently to basically any other faction in the game. Similar to their lore, they don't really care so much about the battle as we would consider it. Instead, they tend to be more focused on scoring than other factions. Tyranids are fairly unique in that they actually have two army abilities in place of just one. The first one is Synapse. In order to control the vast swarms of organisms, they have a synapse web that is broadcast by their more powerful creatures that controls their smaller ones. The Synapse ability grants a bonus in melee, as well as makes your army much more difficult to battle shock while your units are within range of Synapse. Normally, you will have Synapse creatures in your army, units with the Synapse keyword, which typically are your characters and your leaders, and these will broadcast a 6-inch aura that makes themselves and others within that aura more difficult to suffer battle shock. In addition, they also have the Shadow in the Warp. This is a once-per-game ability that you can use at the start of any player's turn if you have a unit with the Shadow in the Warp ability on the battlefield. This is typically your characters that are also Synapse creatures. If you do, every enemy unit in their opposing army must immediately take a battle shock check. This gives them the opportunity to fail, lose control of any objectives that they might be holding, as well as prevent them from being targeted with stratagems. This can make armies that are very reliant on stratagems fall apart, and it can also give you an enormous amount of control over scoring, as well as sometimes interacting with some of your other abilities depending on the units and detachment that you're playing. Now, this emphasis on scoring carries over to Tyranid units as well. Tyranids tend to have a very high model count compared to other factions. They are a swarm faction, so they tend to take lots of large units of small models, and these tend to give the army a lot of control over primary objectives. A lot of times what you're trying to do is swarm the board with smaller creatures that your opponent can't kill so that you can hold objectives and score points. These little units don't typically tend to do much damage. The actual damage from your army tends to come from larger monsters and bigger infantry like Tyranid warriors, who will follow up after the smaller bugs and clean up their mess. That said, while Tyranid creatures tend to be pretty well statted defensively for their cost, they don't tend to have the best offensive stats. So you'll find that playing Tyranids, many times you will struggle to deal the amount of damage that your opponent is doing back to you, but you have so many models that it doesn't matter so much, and you can retain control of objectives for long enough that your opponent won't be able to catch you on your score. Now, when it comes to building your army, I always recommend that new players start with a combat patrol. This is a smaller format of 40k game and will give you a good handle on the core mechanics of the game as well as the mechanics of your army. Once you have a couple games of combat patrol under your belt, it's time to graduate to larger games. Now, Tyranids have several combat patrols available to them. The one that I recommend you get into is called the Vardengast Swarm. This is essentially the contents of the 40k starter set for Tyranids. Unfortunately for us, this combat patrol is a little disjointed in the units that it includes. It has a Psychophage, which is kind of a support monster, a Winged Tyranid Prime, which is more of a support character for warrior units, as well as some other kind of semi-useful units. Von Ryan's Leapers and Termagants will see play in many lists and detachments. However, none of it really comes together as a cohesive whole. That said, we can use use most of these units in a variety of list builds, whereas other Tyranid detachments are a little bit more focused on very specific detachments, such as Vanguard Onslaught, which is a little bit more complicated and I wouldn't recommend for a new player. Once you have a couple games in with that Varden Ghast Swarm Combat Patrol, it's time to get into Incursion level 40k. This is the smallest officially supported point size for 40k. That allows us to build a 1,000 point force and choose a detachment. Now, the detachment that I recommend you choose is the Invasion Fleet detachment. This is a very quintessential Tyranid detachment that gives you a very wide toolbox to assist your army in fighting a variety of enemies, as well as very well supports the Tyranid game plan. At the beginning of each game, Invasion Fleet allows your army to adapt to whatever enemy it's fighting. This gives you benefits either against enemy monsters and vehicles, heavy units where you can get lethal hits that will make your lighter attacks more likely to deal damage to them, or sustained hits against infantry, which allows you to kill potentially even more infantry than you would otherwise. You can choose this every game, so you have the opportunity to adapt your army to a wide variety of enemies. You also have some very basic defensive abilities, like having access to a 5+ Feel No Pain, some buffs that you can use to improve yourself in melee, as well as, importantly for this army, a way to regenerate models back into your Termagant units to allow you to maintain control of objectives. And that interaction is going to be a big part of the lists that we talk about today. So in order to build this list into 1,000 points from the Combat Patrol, we've added a couple new units and actually removed one of them. We removed the 5 Barb Gaunts that were in the Combat Patrol originally. Those are very specifically designed to deal with light infantry that don't have a very good armor save. Obviously, you don't know whether or not you're going to be fighting those when you construct your list, so they are only good in very specific circumstances when you know you're going to be fighting against those units, so they're not a very good all-rounder unit. Instead, what we've done is we've added a unit of 6 melee weapon Tyranid warriors to the army. The Winged Tyranid Prime is kind of lonely without an attached unit. He's basically just a support piece for a warrior unit, so the fact that the Combat Patrol has him without an attachment is a little bit sad, and we want to give him some friends. So he has 6 of those guys to join in. They can get a lot of benefits from the Tyranid detachment abilities. You have some good stratagems to use with them, and also they just act as a good piece to counterattack enemies that are coming forward to deal with your hordes of little Gribblies. From there, we've also added an additional unit of Termagants, speaking of those little Gribblies. And we've added some backline shooting in the form of a Tyrannifex and an Exocrine. Now, these big ranged weapon monsters are where the majority of your damage in Tyranids is going to be coming from. Depending on what you expect to be facing, the Tyrannifex can either be equipped with a Rupture Cannon or an Acid Spray. The Acid Spray is good at clearing lighter units like light infantry, but generally speaking, the thing that Tyranids really want to be doing is killing heavy targets like tanks, and the Rupture Cannon is usually what you're going to be playing him with. The Exocrine is a little bit more well-rounded. He has a pretty solid shooting attack and is relatively inexpensive, but can even buff up the Tyrannifex when shooting at whatever the Exocrine fired at previously. His gun's kind of a jack of all trades. It has Blast, so it gains additional attacks when targeting large enemy units with a bunch of models in them, but it's also high enough AP and damage that it can, in some circumstances, punch through the armor of heavy infantry or even heavy vehicles. Last, and certainly not least, we also have a Biovore in here. The Biovore actually doesn't do any damage itself. It can shoot its gun and do maybe a little bit of damage, but largely it's in here to generate new units called Spore Mines. These Spore Mines are pretty useful because you can use them to fulfill a lot of roles on the tabletop. This includes taking up board space to screen so enemies can't come out of reserve near you, but you can also use them to score some secondaries. Secondary objectives that don't require you to hold objectives are great for Spore Mines because while they don't control objectives and can't perform actions because they have an OC characteristic of 0, Spore Mines are still good at being in a location. So if you have any objectives that require you to be in the enemy deployment zone or in a table quarter, for example, the Biovore is very useful for that. In addition, Spore Mines can also restrict enemy movements by preventing them from advancing, which is also pretty important too. These guys are just very cheap and very useful, and he's a good unit to sit on your back objective for the entire game and score some points. Now, when it comes to playing this army on the tabletop, there's a couple really key maneuvers that are important to keep in mind. One of them is playing with these large units of Termagants. One of the biggest benefits that these guys have, especially in the Invasion Fleet detachment, as well as in other detachments like Assimilation Swarm, or if we bring a unit like a Turvagon that can regenerate these models back into their unit, is that they have the ability to potentially take casualties but still retain control of objective markers. And as I mentioned several times, that's the biggest thing that we're focusing on when we're playing Tyranids. They're just trying to farm the battlefield for biomass. They're less interested in actually fighting with their opponent. So while we can regenerate models back to this unit, one of the important things that we're going to try to be doing is making them as sticky for our opponent to kill as possible, so it's difficult for them to destroy the entire unit. Once the unit is destroyed, there's no models there remaining for you to regenerate, but as long as we can keep just a couple models in the unit alive, we can still use them to hold down objectives and to act as utility. Now, the Psychophage helps with this a little bit, and as we move on and graduate to larger game sizes, we can include some more support units that can make these Termagants harder to kill. The Psychophage provides a 6+ feel no pain to the units around him, meaning that each time the unit takes damage, there's a 1 in 6 chance that they will instead not take any damage. Similarly, it's important to refresh yourself on the cover and terrain rules in Warhammer 40k to make sure that you can always be benefiting from cover on as many of these models in the unit as possible. I have an entire video in my Ridiculous Rules series where I deep dive into the cover and terrain rules that you can take a look at if you are interested. Now, I've gone through about a movement phase with these models to showcase some ways that we can utilize the coherency and the damage rules in 40k to manipulate these large units to receiving as much damage as possible before they die. Now, we want to be holding this objective basically at the beginning of our turn. So we've put a couple of Termagants out into the open in order to do that. They have to be overlapping the area of the objective marker in order for you to score at the start of your turn, and that's what we're trying to set up. Now, if these guys are standing here, your opponent is going to come out of their deployment zone and going to try to kill them. However, as we can see, we have the rest of the unit standing just a couple inches behind them in a hidden spot that is, importantly, off the objective marker. The unit is so big, however, that each model can be within 2 inches of 2 other models in the unit, and they can trail back pretty far. And if you watch very, very competitive players do this, they can actually string this to take up enormous amounts of space, multiple feet across the table, where you can have models holding an objective or in an important area of the table, and then strung all the way back 2 inches between each model, all the way back to their support units. In this case, we have the Psychophage, who's giving our models their 6+ feel no pain, and we're going to be using these coherency to bring the unit into the range of that aura all the way back here. Now, as soon as our opponent starts attacking these models, each attack will inflict damage based on the number of hits and wounds our opponent rolls, and you have to receive that damage regardless of whether or not your opponent can see you. So let's say our opponent makes an attack targeting these Termagants and kills 5 models. We almost always want to kill the models in the front of the unit because the defender always chooses the casualties from a ranged attack before we start taking models from the back. And the reason for this is that our opponent then has less line of sight with future attacks in order to attack these models. However, it's important to remember all these guys will get that feel no pain from the Psychophage. What we're trying to do is limit the spillover damage from these attacks. So as I said, let's say we were attacked by some bolt guns and we lost 5 models. So we've taken 3 casualties here in the front of the unit, and now we can take another 2 from the models in the back. From there, if our opponent is just coming out of their deployment zone, they can no longer see the Termagants. Line of sight can't be drawn through these ruins unless the attacker or the target is within them, and even though we are within the ruin over here, there is a solid wall that's blocking line of sight to the remainder of our unit. That is the perfect setup for these Termagants, because what we're going to do is once we come back to the Tyranid player's command phase, we can use the Endless Swarm stratagem to regenerate D3+3 Termagants back into our unit. So, in this case, let's say we got 4 Termagants back, so we're going to pick 4 Termagants. They just simply have to be placed 2 inches away from a model that is already inside the unit. so we can place those termagants back in the front of our unit and back on the objective. And this is a very common strategy that's used in Tyranids to try to hold down these objectives in the center of the table while making it difficult for our opponent to kill the majority of these termagants. You have to chew through all 20 of them in one go, or have line of sight to basically the entire unit in order to do it in multiple activations, in order to kill all these models and prevent them from then regenerating back onto the objective. Now, this doesn't make them invincible. Our opponent could, shoot them with a couple of units and then run in and charge with some other units to actually kill the unit. However, that requires them to move forward and expose themselves for our larger bugs to then counterattack. And that is a big part of Tyranid strategy. They want to be feeding their smaller units into the meat grinder in order to threaten scoring on their opponent, to try to beat them on the score and force their opponent to come fight them where their more numerous units can come in and hit back really hard. And we also have this warrior unit that's sitting in the back here, waiting for an enemy to come and try to fight over this objective so that they can just pounce and try to counterattack that. And that's a big reason that we have these warriors in this build. Now, I want to discuss this Tyranid Prime a little bit as well, because when you're using the Tyranid Warriors, there's a really weird interaction that he brings to the table, and that is his really long movement characteristic. Now, he attaches into units of Tyranid Warriors that are only movement 6, which is fairly normal for infantry units, but on the whole of 40k, it's very slow. However, he is movement 12. That means that when you move the unit, every not Tyranid Prime model inside the unit is going to move 6 inches, but the character is going to move 12. This means that if we put him at the back of the formation, he can kind of act as a threat range or a movement extender because he can leapfrog the rest of the unit. So he's not taking up real estate in the front here. However, when we are moving them, we'll move all our regular warriors 6 inches when we're trying to get them into melee with our opponent. There we go, something like that. And then this guy can then move 12. So he can move from the back of the unit to the front. And as we've done that, we've actually gained several inches of movement. Not only do we have a model in the back that's now in the front, but we've also added 3 or even 4 inches sometimes of additional threat range from that model. Once your unit charges into an enemy, all of these just slow melee warriors that are sitting in the back here are going to be able to pile into that fight and actually get into melee. So we're using the Winged Tyranid Prime to basically leapfrog our unit into the fight, and using his longer movement in order to extend the threat range of these warriors, which is admittedly relatively slow all by itself. Now, with all that being said, these larger bugs are kind of your big tanks. They're supposed to be the damage absorbers for the army once the battle is joined and once your little bugs have gotten into the fight. Typically, it's best to give long-range units like this flank positions where they can get good lines of sight around the terrain in the center of the table. However, it's always important not to give your opponent shots on them too early. You don't really want to give your opponent the ability to shoot you in the first turn or so, because there's not really any benefit to it. However, once they move out and your opponent has started to commit to the fight because you are using termagants to hold down the center objectives, you could use the Psychophage in conjunction with, for example, the Tyrannifex's ability to once per game blank damage of an incoming attack to make these guys very difficult to kill and make them win that shooting match. All the while, you have a Biovore sitting in the back here who's going to be lobbing Spore Mines into areas of the table to block enemy movement or to score objectives, and we can use these multiple termagant units to try to maintain control over these flank objectives. We also have the Von Ryan's Leapers. These are forward operators. They have the Infiltrator's ability, which allows them to begin the game outside of your deployment zone, and that allows them to potentially start a little bit more aggressively, block your opponent in from moving and competing over your objectives, or simply going and scoring objectives themselves. These guys, they do hit fairly hard against infantry, but they're also very fast, and that makes them an excellent what we call a utility unit, which is just a unit that's used to screen out enemies and their reserves, score secondary objectives, or movement block enemies. These are very useful units to have, and Tyranids have some of the best of them in the game. Now with that, we're going to graduate to a full-size game of Warhammer 40k, the Strike Force game size. This is 2,000 points, so it represents a doubling of the value of an Incursion game, and it's the standard game size for especially competitive events in Warhammer 40k, as well as the game size that the game's missions and game balance is designed around. Now, as you can see, we've kind of extrapolated the composition that we built for our Incursion to the next level. We've added 2 additional exocrines. They are very inexpensive for the amount of firepower that they bring, so they're very easy to take in trios, as well as an additional Tyrannifex that you can either add as an anti-infantry build with an acid spray or as another rupture cannon build in order to use him to clear out tanks. We've also added some additional support. The first one, and the most important thing, in my opinion, are these Venom Thropes. Venom Thropes provide stealth to infantry that are nearby them, so when you are performing that chain that we talked about in the Incursion section, where you're using your termagants to string all the way back to your support units like your Psychophage, you can also be doing that to the Venom Thropes, and doing so will make them even more difficult to kill. They're going to be getting the Feel No Pain from the Psychophage, as well as potentially -1 to be hit from ranged attacks, which is the benefit of stealth from the Venom Thropes as well. So we're just trying to make these units as sticky to kill as possible, so your opponent has a tough time killing them all in one go. Now, kind of an important piece for many Tyranid armies is the Hive Tyrant. This guy is a fairly powerful character monster who can hit reasonably hard in melee. However, he's relatively slow, but the big benefit is that he speeds up your army by giving your monsters nearby him assault, so they're able to advance and shoot their weapons, as well as lethal hits, which makes them good even if you're choosing the sustained hits adaptation from the Invasion Fleet detachment. But most importantly, he also gives you a lot of command points back, so you're able to use a strategy at a discounted cost, both in your turn and your opponent's turn. So he's able to give you things like the Endless Swarm stratagem during your turn to regenerate termagants for free, as long as the termagant unit is within 12 inches of him, and you can use rapid regeneration to give yourself a Feel No Pain on your opponent's turn, even on your larger monsters and your units that are not within the Psychophage's aura. So he can generate you maybe somewhere around 10 command points worth of free stratagems every game, because he's going to give you the equivalent of 5, 1 on each of your turns, and 5, 1 on each of your opponent's turns, as long as you have the opportunities to do so. And it's always important to remember with this guy to keep him in range of the units that you think you'll need to use stratagems on, and also if you have extra activations of the Hive Tyrant left, remember that you can just start using his aura on stratagems randomly. If you have it floating and you're about to lose it because the turn's about to end, you might as well reroll a damage roll or something on one of your attacks using a command reroll for free from his aura, because there's not really any reason not to use that efficiency if you haven't used it yet. The other important unit that we're going to be including here is a Neuro Tyrant. This guy helps you out by projecting Neuroloids to your units to keep them in Synapse. That's especially good for your Termagants who might be ranging out in front of your army or been killed down to the point where they're no longer inside your Synapse range because the models that were near your Synapse creatures were killed. He can then point a Neuroloid at that unit and cause them to be counted as in Synapse before they take battle shock checks. You always do all your command phase stuff, like doing the Neuroloids from the Neuro Tyrant or regenerating models with Endless Swarm, before you take any battle shock checks that you would normally have to for the unit being below half strength. So even if you're down to 1 or 2 termagants remaining out of a unit, as long as they're within 18 inches of the Neuro Tyrant, he can force them to count as Synapse and get a bonus on their battle shock check. So you can try to keep them around to hold objectives for as long as possible. He also gives you an improvement on your Shadow in the Warp by giving your opponent a -1 penalty on those tests, which is often equivalent to a huge penalty. Because battle shock checks are on a 2d6 roll, a -1 tends to change the bell curve quite a bit. So based on what your opponent's leadership is, you might be battle shocking 15 or 20% more of their army than you would normally. That's a big benefit for the Neuro Tyrant, and he makes that army ability really good. He also has a pretty good flamethrower, so he's good at clearing out enemy infantry too if he wants to. Now, when using the Strike Force army, the basic principles of the Incursion army are largely the same. Usually what we'll want to do is keep our defensive support units in a protected position, especially these Venom Thropes, because they tend to be pretty squishy if your opponent can get line of sight to them, and then string our large termagant units back to them to consistently benefit from those auras. We can then use the termagants to try to disrupt enemy control of objectives or respawn them onto objectives to maintain control of them yourself. You always want the Hive Tyrant to be behind a centrally located piece of terrain. This ruin is a great one. He is relatively large, so he's not often able to hide hide behind the walls of terrain features. Many times he's too big. But keeping him behind these ruins once your army has moved allows him to broadcast his CP discount aura to basically all the relevant parts of the table. And once your army has started to commit, most of them are usually inside the range of that aura. And then on battle round 3 or 4 and towards the late game, he can move forward and get stuck in himself. You don't want to commit him to the fight too early, because if you lose him very early, it's going to be really ugly. You're going to end up losing a lot of potential command points by letting that guy die. And he's not that difficult to kill. He doesn't have too many wounds. So once he's exposed himself, if your opponent has any good anti-tank, they're going to take him out. However, if he can come in towards the late game where you've attritioned down a lot of your opponent's units and you've also put yourself in a position to win on scoring, he can come in and he can close out the game by killing a couple of key units so that you can maintain that scoring lead. But I wouldn't do that too early on in the game. Oftentimes you'll also find that it's useful to keep some of your models in strategic reserve, especially your big gun bugs. It's very difficult to get a position where all of your guns can either be safe or get into position to shoot relevant enemy targets all at the same time. And keeping models in strategic reserve, which you can do to up to 25% of your army, so 500 points in a Strike Force game, allows them to come in off a table edge later on in the game, from Battle Round 2 onwards, and get some really easy shots through the middle. While you can use some stratagems like Rapid Ingress to make this a little bit better for melee units, you oftentimes don't need to for ranged units. And if your opponent doesn't screen you out really aggressively, oftentimes when they've moved up their big armored units to come try to compete with you, you can then counterattack by bringing your big monsters out of strategic reserve and counter-shooting them. That's really helpful to essentially extend your deployment zone and give you more places where these big relevant monsters can set up, and then also opening up new lines of sight across the table for them to shoot down. It's very difficult, for example, to get a gun to this line of sight early on in the game, so if your opponent is hiding in this area, you can't really control that unless you are using strategic reserves to get your models into that position. Now, another interesting question is when to trigger Shadow in the Warp. It's especially relevant once you have a Nero Tyrant in your army. Oftentimes, if you can do so in a position where 1 or 2 failed battle shock checks will cause your opponent to lose a bunch of points because they lose control of their objectives, because battle shocked units become OC0, I would wait for an opportunity like that. Importantly, if you're playing with tactical secondary objectives using the Pariah Nexus packet, at least at the time of recording it is, you might get a new one in the future, you choose to trigger the Shadow in the Warp after you see what your opponent's cards for the start of their turn are, their tactical objective cards. So sometimes you can actually wait for a period where they draw a lot of cards that require them to perform actions. Battle shocked units can't perform actions, so using a Shadow in the Warp at that stage can also disrupt their ability to score those tactical objectives. In addition, if your opponent has any really powerful stratagems that they're looking to use, using Shadow in the Warp at the start of that turn is also going to be pretty powerful. And the best case scenario to use it is in a situation where you can use it at the start of your opponent's turn, disrupt some of their scoring, and then make it so they can't use offensive stratagems on some key units during their turn, and then when it comes back to your turn, you can counterattack them, and they can't use defensive stratagems on that turn as well. They can't overwatch you or use any protective stratagems that they may have. That's the best case scenario. You won't get one of those every single game, but those are the times to look for it. Essentially, if you can use it before your opponent's like a go turn when their army's going to come out and fight you, that's the best case scenario. However, it's also important to keep in mind that it is a random effect. You don't know which models in your opponent's army are going to be battle shocked, if any. So it's always important to consider that you may just get very little benefit from it for that game. And that's just the way of things. So with that, we have a fairly competent Strike Force list built out of the Vardengast Swarm Combat Patrol. This is a fairly reasonable example of Tyranids played at a competitive level, and while I don't know if it's going to win any major tournaments anytime soon, it might need a little bit of optimization for that, it's definitely going to give you some competitive games even into stronger armies. Especially if you can use movement and model placement to maintain control over objectives, that's really where Tyranids' bread and butter is, and that's really what you want to be doing. In terms of ways to expand the army, you can play into some more of the lighter units like the Von Ryan's Leapers, as well as Lictors and Gene Stealers if you want to play a more aggressive melee army like a Vanguard Onslaught. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, those armies tend to be kind of difficult to play, so once you have a couple games in with Invasion Fleet, I would give that a shot. You can also play some very similar builds out of detachments like Assimilation Swarm, which makes great use of the Psychophage. And if you want to play some more melee-oriented monsters or just more monsters in general, you can swap out some of the infantry for more of them and play an army like Crusher Stampede. So let me know down in the comment section what you think of these example list builds and the variety of Tyranids that you're most excited about playing. Also, let me know if you have a faction that you want me to cover on this series, and if you feel like supporting me, you can do so either down in the video description, where you can join my YouTube channel membership, or at Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, or if you watch me over on Twitch, where I stream all of my games of Warhammer 40k on Tabletop Simulator. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.